Thank you all for having me here. My name is Alice Linahan, and I am with an organization called Women on the Wall. And Women on the Wall takes on three major issues: education, immigration, and national security. And we look at how they all intersect. And my expertise now is in education. And someone asked me what our mission is, and I said, you know, we are not a well-funded organization. We're pretty much fly by the seat of our pants, two moms trying to get information out. And so we don't have nonprofits or think tanks or foundations funding us. And I think that's actually a blessing in disguise after being involved in kind of the grassroots movement, Tea Party movement over the last 6 years, because I'm in it because I have 3 children. I have a 18-year-old, he just turned 18, a 15-year-old, and a 10-year-old. My only agenda is my kids. So when I go somewhere or speak, or when I go down to Austin or to Washington to talk to elected officials, I'm not talking from, you know, Women on the Wall, a well-funded lobby group or an organization. I'm talking because I'm a mom. And I want to bring the reality of what's happening to my kids to those people who are passing laws and legislation that's affecting my kids. And my eyes have been opened in education like never before. How many of you, and I don't know if y'all have had in some of the school districts around here, if they're using C-Scope. Have any of y'all heard of C-Scope?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So I didn't know anything about really education. I was a grassroots mom, you know, going down to battle Joe Strauss. I thought he was our biggest challenge. And there was this mom who took one of my trainings. I was going around and training people on how to become the media, basically, in their own community so they could get information out to spread information. And so this woman took one of my classes, and she actually listened to me, and she kept sending me all this information about C-Scope. And I was like, look, I'm busy. I'm covering all these other issues. And she was like, well, you told us that we had to find someone who is an influencer to get them to start pushing out this information, and you're an influencer, so push it out. And I started looking at C-Scope, and I didn't really quite understand it, and so we were having the speaker showdown in Austin to take on Joe Strauss, and I asked this woman, her name's Ginger Russell, to come to the speaker showdown and talk about the C-Scope. So she did, and there were other groups there, other grassroots Tea Party groups there. And there was a guy from Frisco there, and he listened to her, and he was blown away. And so there were about 8 groups outside of North Texas, grassroots groups, that pulled together and brought in Janine McGregor, another woman, mom, who understands the education issue, and they brought her in to speak. And from there, it got a virtual team across the state of Texas formed to do public information requests on the amount of money school districts were spending on C-Scope, on TASA, the Texas Association of School Administrators, and TASB, the Texas Association of School Board. And so we got all this financial information in. We sent it to Tom Fabry with the Frisco Tea Party. He extrapolated all the financials out. wrote 2 white papers, one on C-scope and one on TASA and TASB. And there are hundreds of millions of dollars in this education bureaucracy. These are all nonprofit organizations that have direct access to our tax dollars. And the numbers and the corruption was so overwhelming. And we had a meeting in Montgomery County, and I invited, at the time, Senator Dan Patrick, and said, you might want to come to this meeting because we're going to present all this financial information. And he said, oh, I'll be there, because he was running for office. And so then I called Dewhurst's office and I said, well, you might want to come to this meeting because we're going to be presenting all this information. And by the way, Dan Patrick's going to be there. And so, of course, Dewhurst showed up too. And Tom presented the information. And when those 2 elected officials left, they called a full audit of C-scope. Interestingly enough, the first C-scope contract was out of, I think it's Service Center 4, is that in Mount Pleasant? Is it Mount Pleasant? 8, that's it. And so it's interesting that it came out of Service Center 8, and that's where the Ratliff family lives. And so there was a report, the audit, there was a full state audit, and major corruption. Millions of dollars are missing, unaccounted for. We thought, well, surely this is gonna, somebody's gonna do something. No, nothing. So that's where I started finding out the corruption of public school education. And when you look at the Ratliff family, who, by the way, I've had 2 ethics charges filed against me by Thomas Ratliff, because on the day we had Tom Fabry, we have a Wednesday night conference call every Wednesday night. You're all welcome to join us, and you can go to womenonthewall.org and register for that conference call, and you'll get 1 email a week with a call-in number. We had one just last night. You can also go back and listen to the archives and we've been having that conference call for well over a year now. So we had Tom Fabry present on our weekly conference call, and the next morning I got a call from the Texas Ethics Commission, and they said that I had a ethics charge filed against me by Thomas Ratliff, and he said that the organizing that we are doing, that I should be registered as a paid lobbyist. And I said, well, that's pretty interesting, because you have to actually get paid. And isn't that interesting, Thomas Ratliff? Because you should know that, because you are a paid lobbyist and have been for over 13 years with Microsoft. And you're an elected official. By the way, this is very important. There is a very good piece of legislation that's going through the process right now. It's an ethics, Van Taylor has put it through, he's out of North Texas, that explicitly states that you cannot be an elected official and a paid lobbyist. So we need to get that passed. So call Van Taylor's office, call your state reps and state senators and say we need to pass that bill. But this ethics charge was dropped because it was, I'm not getting paid, and then he tried to file it again. But I think he was just trying to scare me off. And it's interesting because my Twitter hashtag became Bring It On. Because I knew if we could use his attack on me to expose who he is. When you look at education today in Texas, and you see things come in like C-scope, which is a system. It's not a set of crazy lessons that Dan Patrick actually cut a deal with the education service centers to get the lessons pooled. What you have to understand is that C-scope is a system. It's 3 parts. It's a scope and sequence, which controls the teacher and keeps the teacher on a timeline. And then it's assessments, and then those crazy lessons. They were fine with pulling the crazy lessons because they can still sell the system of control of the scope and sequence and the assessments. And whoever controls the assessments controls what those lessons are. Let me give you an example of a C-scope lesson. In Argyle, we were starting to use it, and by this time I started to understand what was going on, so I called a community conversation, and we pulled up some live lessons. And in Texas, we have the TEKS, which is the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills Standards. Those standards are the best in the United States. We do have our social studies standards. You've heard there was a huge battle over that. And we have strong standards. So in a C-scope lesson, they kept saying, well, you have to get C-scope because, you know, this crazy new STAR test is coming and you have to be able to pass it. And C-scope is aligned to STAR. Well, let me tell you how C-scope is aligned to STAR. So the lesson was supposed to be over the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Sounds great. We're covering the TEKS. But let's actually look what the lesson is, look what the assessment is. They gave the kids a Time magazine article that went all into the Arab Spring in Libya and basically described the Arab Spring as a democratic process. Do you think the kids in that class know anything about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? No, they don't. So isn't it interesting that C-scope came into Texas, it was put into 875 small and rural communities because they said that it was district-led, that districts were clamoring for it. They had to have that scope and sequence. Well, that's kind of interesting because when you look at Common Core, the Common Core national standards, they said that it was led by the governors. It was state-led by the governors, that the states were just needing to have these national standards. Well, when you start looking at it, the copyright to the Common Core national standards is owned by the NGA, the National Governors Association. It's a think tank, a nonprofit, not think tank, it's a nonprofit organization out of Washington, D.C. that's very well funded by Bill Gates, Gates Foundation, and Pearson. So it was not state-led by the governors, and they own the copyright. In Texas, they said, oh, C-scope, it's district-led. Well, no, the copyright to C-scope is owned by the 20 education service centers whose 20 directors formed a nonprofit organization, and they own the copyright to C-scope. And isn't it interesting because now that Common Core is in place, now you have the College Board. The president of the College Board is a guy named David Coleman, who he's not the mastermind behind Common Core, but he was one of the key players in the Common Core national standards, and he is now the president of the College Board. And he has said that the SAT and the ACT, those college entrance exams, will be aligned to the Common Core national standards. Oh, and isn't it interesting, because the College Board owns the copyright for those assessments. The College Board also owns the copyright for the AP, Advanced Placement, curriculum framework, just like C-Scope, it's a curriculum framework and assessment. It's the same business model. Once you start understanding the strategies and the tactics of implementation, you understand that this is not district-led or state-led. This is being controlled federally. But let me say something. This is not about a liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat system. And I want to read something to you. There's a book, and I highly recommend, if you're wanting to take this on and understand it, there's a book that I recommend you get, and it's called Credentialed to Destroy: How and Why Education Became a Weapon. And the author is a woman named Robin Eubanks. She's out of Georgia. And when you start reading her book and understanding the big picture and seeing in real time what's happening, you realize this is so much bigger. This is so much bigger. This is a nationalization of our education system. And the shift is not liberal or conservative. There's a lot of liberal teachers who are just as horrified as conservative teachers. The shift in education that we're talking about is a shift from the transmission of knowledge, where kids know things, reading, writing, math, and history, where it's an education of opportunity. It used to, we have a K-12 system, kindergarten through 12th grade. When you graduate in 12th grade, you have an opportunity because you can read well, write well, do math, know history. If you decide to go to college, that's great. If you decide to go be an apprentice for a plumbing or a mechanic, whatever, you still know things. You can still write. You have an education of opportunity. The shift is moving from an education of opportunity to an education of equity, based on attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors. And this is not values and morals and social issues. This is about controlling our children, the next generation of voters. When education is focused on how students perceive the world, that is known as critical theory or cultural Marxism. And that's what this is. There's two books that Robin used when she was putting this together. One is called The Killing of History. The other is Social Agendas and the Corruption of the Humanities. And this is interesting. She says that the College Board's SAT and AP advanced placement assessments and conceptual frameworks can be described as transdisciplinary. And transdisciplinary is when the function of the subject matter, concept themes, and syllabus and course frameworks are used to guide how students view the world. The technical term for this is lenses. So effectively, these lenses become the attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors of our children. And this is about actually controlling the economy in the West. When you look at where this is being funded from, and it's interesting because Robin says she's so far into the onion and pulling back the layers that the people involved here are on the right and on the left, and they're big money corporate people. And then there's money coming in from the Carnegie Foundation. It's all these foundations and nonprofit organizations. And what we found out last night on our conference call is that the Carnegie Foundation and the Libyan government and the Libyan government and the Libyan financial tentacles, if you will, are very deep into Pearson. Pearson is the testing company. They also own all the textbooks. And that's why you see this infiltration of the, it's not Muslim, because this is not a religion. It's not Islam. It's the fundamental Islamist who, it's a political, it's not religion, it's political. But they're making it in. When you see these lessons, when you see these crazy lessons, it is about desensitizing our children to the actual threats that we face. When in Lumberton ISD you have 15-year-old girls wearing burqas like it's a costume, that's a problem, because I don't know if y'all know who Frank Gaffney is with the Center for Security Policy, but he talks about it being a slow creeping jihad. There's a violent jihad, and then this is actually a pre-violent jihad. So you've got money coming in, because if it's a template, if the way that they're teaching is a template to get children to change their attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors to submit, that can be coming from the Islamists, can also be coming from people, corporate entities that just want to control the next generation. So you've got different people with different agendas who are coming together. It's interesting when you look at the pro-school choice and the anti-school choice. Because on the right, the Republicans, all they say is the answer is school choice, but they're not talking about what's actually being taught in the classroom. They're just saying the answer is school choice, school choice. On the left, both sides are trying to get control of our children's mind. Yes,
Isn't the Carnegie controlled by the Bilderbergs or the Rockefellers? What?
It's all connected.
Yes.
Yes, it's all connected.
Yeah.
You're right. So what's interesting is, think about this. Think about this. If they collapse our public school system by saying how awful our public schools are, and they collapse our public school system, and then everything becomes charter schools, which are still public schools, what's the difference between a traditional public school and a charter public school? A charter public school is run by an appointed board. An appointed board is beholden to whoever's giving the money. If it's coming from a corporation or an organization, that's who's controlling it. The beauty of our public school system is a locally elected school board. So both sides want to collapse the public school system or reshape the public school system. And when you look at legislation nationally, right now the Congress is going through the process of trying to reauthorize the ESEA, which stands for Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was passed originally in 1965 to provide money to children of poverty to get a good education. It was 35 pages long in 1965. It was reauthorized and became the No Child Left Behind Act, which that's when it brought in all the assessments and testing requirements. And then now this version, it's HR 5, Student Success Act, it's over 1,100 pages. And what's scary about this ESEA reauthorization is they've changed And this is what's scary about legislation, is they change the definition of terms in the legislation. So now the federal government through the ESCA would give Title I money to children of poverty. Well, now you're no longer, in order to get that Title I money, you're no longer economically deprived. They changed it to academically deprived. So if you're not under the college and career ready standards, now you can get that Title I federal money. Do you see what they do? And in that legislation, they're also trying to push, and the Republicans are pushing school choice, school choice, school choice. Well, they have this super voucher. So when the money follows the child, because of ESCA and also WIOA, which stands for Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, that is already passed. And in Texas, we have to report to the federal government in July on our progress on the WIOA. And what WIOA does is it binds K through 12 education with the Labor Department, the Health and Human Services, and the Department of Ed. So even if we just got rid of the Department of Ed, they're already binding these. And they're binding them, they're shifting away from a K-12 system to what's called a P20W, which stands for preschool through the workforce. And so you've got the ESCA, you've got WIOA that's already passed. And not only did they change the definition of who can give that Title I money, but when they changed in there the rights of parents, basically, that other people have authority to help your child in the system. But what's scary is if that money follows the child to that private school, because we passed school choice, when that private school takes the money, then those students force that private school to provide what's called direct student services. And you have just now federalized your private schools. So you've collapsed your public schools because everyone leaves because they're so bad. You've privatized your, you federalized your private schools, and then you've put money in the hands of the corporate entities that want to make money off of charter schools. Yes, sir.
That could probably filter into the Christian schools.
You're exactly right. And what's interesting is Title IX, which, and I get mixed up on the years, I think it was passed in '75, but that's your, the act that says you can't discriminate based on race, religion, all of that. Well, I don't know if you remember, but when Obama was first elected, he brought in a education czar, Kevin Jennings, and they changed Title IX to where when it says sex, meaning you can't discriminate over a male or a female, they changed the language in Title IX to where you can't discriminate over sexual preference. So if that's one of the scary things, is if those private schools have an opinion on homosexuality, they can be deemed as going against the law. It's very scary, the manipulation that can come with legislation. And so in Texas, we have all this big school choice, which, let's define school choice. As a mom, I have the right, as a mother, a father, or a guardian, to provide my child the best education opportunity that they have. That right does not come from the state or the federal government. That right comes from God. I'm the mom. I have that choice. I've already got that choice. It's interesting because in the ESEA reauthorization, John Culbertson, who is a congressman out of Houston, he has this language in there, and he says in there that the state can opt in to taking this grant money, the ESEA federal funds. We can opt in. Instead of having to opt out later, we would rather opt in. But we opt into that just by passing the state budget. How many of our elected officials actually know what's in the state budget line by line? None of them, especially on the education front. So all they have to do is pass the budget, and then we've opted into ESEA. Well, what we're doing is when we opt in, we're handing our state sovereignty to the federal government. And what I was trying to tell John Culbertson's office, you don't have that. Congress doesn't give us our sovereignty. The Constitution gives us our sovereignty. You don't have a right to pass the budget and hand my state sovereignty to the federal government. Well, it's the same way with school choice. I don't get my school choice from the state and federal government. I get that choice because I'm the mom. So by passing legislation, what I'm saying is I need the government, I need the state to tell me what assessments that private school is going to be giving. I'm handing my child over. And in this shift, we hear about this big bad STAR test that our kids are having to take. Well, it is bad because Pearson authored it and administers it. So I have a problem with the STAR test. But our TEKS, our standards, except for the math, because there's a problem with the math, are clearly grade specific or class specific, and they are what Donna Garner calls type 1, foundational, where one concept builds on the next, builds up. You have a foundation. So that test right now that our kids are taking is based on facts and knowledge. What happens, you have this big opt-out movement, and I completely understand it, and at a national level with the PARC and the Smarter Balance, those national assessments, there is a belief, and the more I dig into this, the more I believe it, that that is a strategy to get rid of the test, but what are they bringing in instead? Through WIOA and the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, what it is they're shifting the assessment, the tests, away from tests on knowledge to assessments, and they're assessing competency for the workforce. You know, in Texas, we said no to the Common Core national standards, but we didn't need to say yes because we're already implementing it. Dan Patrick, and you know, some of these guys, thank you for being pro-life. I'm pro-life. I appreciate that. But you know what? Protect kids in the womb and in the classroom, because what you're doing in the classroom is awful to our kids. So I don't care that, I care that you're pro-life, but let's get it right on education too. Because we didn't pass Common Core, or we passed a law that said no to Common Core, but right then we passed HB 5. What does HB 5 do? It sets up 5 pathways to graduation. They have to decide at the end of 8th grade what they want to be when they grow up. How many people know what they want to be when they grow up? And that decision is made based on assessments, competency assessments, competence for a job. So the state government is just going to pay for whatever you assess to be competent for. What happened to our tax dollars paying to educate kids to read well, write well, do math, and know history so that they had an education of opportunity. Basically, what we're doing is a Soviet model of education. That is really scary. And it's interesting, in Robin's book, she talks about the Turchenko model. And in 1975, there was a letter written in the Soviet Union that a year later was translated into English, and a book was written, A Revolution Through Technology and Education. And in it, they lay out the blueprint for the federal takeover. And it's interesting, Robin Eubanks, how she got into this. She's a security and exchange attorney by trade. And back in the 90s, she was tasked with writing a report on the impact of Hillary Care on this company that she worked for. And so a few years later, she was a mom, and her children were in an IB, an International Baccalaureate school. And she was going to school board meetings, and she's going, wait a minute, that's the same language that they're using in Hillary Care. It's all connected. It's the blueprint for the federal takeover. They need the health care. They take over the health care. They take over the education. And there's an infamous letter by a guy named Mark Tucker that he wrote to Hillary Clinton and basically laid out, it's in the congressional record, laid out the blueprint. And what's scary is that Turchenko explains that this takeover will go undetected because it's an education system to change the behaviors of the next generation into submission. And when you think about it, and you think about our education system, this is actually the third radical education reform in U.S. history. The first was back in the late 60s, early 70s, and then the second one was in the late 80s, early 90s, and it's nothing new. It's all outcome-based education. And when you read Robin's book, she starts connecting the dots with the professors at the university level. And she says in her book, she said, you know, the Soviets had sympathizers in the U.S. And they were the professors who had access to the next generation of our children. And they had access to be in a position, or they had the ability to be in a position to implement what she calls unilateral mental disarmament. And it's about teaching strategies. And we think, oh, it's just liberal indoctrination. No, it's not. It's teaching strategies of submission and dumbing down a society. And they use teaching strategies, for instance, in English and teaching kids how to read. Back in 1908, there was a guy, Edmund Henry Burke, I think is his name. That was when we moved, or he transitioned from teaching children how to decode words and phonics so that you could learn the original meaning of a word to sight words. If a child has the ability to, he or she himself, figure out what the true definition of a word is, he's not necessarily going to buy the propaganda. With sight words, children are dependent, and even us, we're dependent on someone to tell us what that word means. They change the definitions of words. So you see it in English, but then you also see it in math. And one of the problems that we have, and I highly recommend that you go on womenonthewall.org and listen to an interview that we had with Dr. Jim Milgram. He's a fascinating man. He's a math professor at Stanford, and he was appointed to validate the Common Core national standards in math. And he refused to do it because he said it would put our children behind 2 to 3 years in math. And he said if they're in this system for more than 4 years, they're gone. They'll never get it back. Because they just won't. They'll do something else. And when you look at the math standards here in Texas, our new math TEKS that were passed in 2012, but this is the first year that we're going to be testing on it in the STAR test. He was a part of that. And there was another woman, Nikona Hayes or Nikki Hayes. She wrote the book, and I highly recommend you get this book too, The Story of Saxon Math, of John Saxon. And she was a part of the writing team. And she was the one that demanded that our elementary children not be allowed to use calculators in elementary school, which is a good thing. And if you look at our math standards, they are foundational where one concept builds on the next. But it's interesting because in our interview with Dr. Milgram, he pulled out. He would not validate the Texas standards. Why? Because the Dana Center, which is at the University of Texas, and who's doing a lot of the training for our school districts, there were people connected with the Dana Center that implemented or put process TEKS at the beginning of each grade level in the math standards. And it's the process TEKS that make it Common Core. Common Core is a philosophy of education. It's where everything's subjective, where there's different possibilities. And so the process standards are in the Texas math TEKS at the beginning of every grade level. If you were to get rid of those process TEKS, we would have the best standards in the nation. But those process TEKS are there. So the 20 education service centers are doing professional development using the Common Core methods or progressive teaching strategies, which make it to where our children are not learning their multiplication tables. They're not learning the foundation. They're given different, they say we want them to critically think and learn different strategies to do it, the different processes that you can do to learn math. Well, what we found in Common Core math across the country is the same exact thing as we're finding here in Texas. It's developmentally inappropriate to put second graders at a table and say, well, let's look at the different ways that we can do the problem 2 + 2 is 4. Why don't you, Johnny, you do it, you show me how you do it, Sue, you show me how you do it, and then we'll decide what the right answers are. No. In second grade, we should be learning our multiplication tables. If you have a solid foundation later on in life, then it's developmentally appropriate to do critical thinking and look at different processes. But if we don't have a foundation, we've just dumbed down the system. Because like my 4th grader comes home and he has to know all these different processes and he hates math. But you know what? It's really funny because in 1st and 2nd grade, he loved math because he was learning the concepts and he thought he was great at math. Now, he hates math and he thinks he's dumb because he doesn't know all these processes. Yes, sir.
Except for the symbols used for numbers, math was not changed in 6,000 years.
You're exactly right.
And the way they're setting it up now, if you run out of batteries, you won't be able to do math.
Yes. It's interesting because today we had a tragedy in Argyle. We had a building collapse. The athletic building, it was under construction. And I just kept thinking, you know, and I don't know what caused that building to collapse. It could have been anything. But I was speaking in Houston, and there was a man in the room, and he does the big boom, the cranes out offshore. He's an engineer. And he said, I have to know the right answer. I don't get points for the process. I have to know the right answer, because if I don't know the right answer as an engineer, people are going to die. What we're doing is we're teaching our children that everything is relative. There are no absolutes. And we're dumbing down our children.
Math was one field where there is absolutes.
Exactly. But it's, and what you have to understand, just like in 1908, when he switched from decoding words to sight words, he had a political purpose. It wasn't about educating the kids on what the true meaning of words were. He had a political purpose in propaganda. It's the same way with math. It's a political purpose in dumbing down our society. You know, it's interesting because I had a meeting at Region Service Center 11, and I was talking to the curriculum director, and I said, did Linda Darling Hammond write C-Scope? Because I had this PowerPoint C-Scope presentation that the districts were using, and it said, Linda Darling Hammond, Professional Development. And I said, did Linda Darling Hammond write C-Scope? And she said, no, you don't understand. It was written for Texas teachers, by Texas teachers, but they use Linda Darling Hammond's philosophy of education. And I said, really? That's interesting. Because I've read books by Linda Darling Hammond, I've looked at video of Linda Darling Hammond, and Linda Darling Hammond believes in equalizing America in the world through education. Is that what you're telling me you're doing? But you have to understand, this girl had no idea who Linda Darling Hammond really is. And I'll close with this, and if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to stay and answer. How many of y'all know who Brandon Darby is? Have y'all seen anything by Brandon Darby? He's the editor-in-chief of Breitbart, Texas. And he's doing a phenomenal job in covering the drug cartel and the illegal immigration issues on the border. So I highly recommend you follow him. But Brandon is kind of an amazing guy. His claim to fame, if you will, it's kind of scary. He became the FBI informant that stopped the bombing of the Republican National Convention in 2008. And he was on the far left. He was a young kid, ran away from Beaumont, and went to Austin, and he was living on the streets. And he was hanging out with the Black Panthers and progressives. And so there was a group that started to plan the bombing of the convention. And what's interesting about his story is he talks about how they organized into the green group, the yellow group, and the red group. The green group were just good, honest, hardworking Democrats that just disagreed with the Republicans. They weren't bad people. They weren't bad. They just disagreed, and they organized them to go to the Republican National Convention and hold up protest signs. They weren't doing anything bad. Then they had the yellow group. They were a little more radical, a little more in the know, and they were supposed to lock arm in arm with PVC pipe to hold back the police. Then you had the red group. They're the ones who would actually throw the Molotov cocktail or harm people. The green group didn't know about the yellow group, and the red group was organizing it all. That same day that I was at Region 11 Service Center and talking to them, I was talking to the director, and he was trying to tell me how wonderful C-Scope was. And I said, look, Dr. Stillman, you and I are just going to have to agree to disagree, because I've looked at it, I've looked at the lessons, and I don't think it's good. But let me tell you a story. And I told him about the green, yellow, and red people. And I said, look, I don't think you're a Marxist, a communist, a socialist that's trying to indoctrinate my kids, but you're green. Your family's income is tied to you renting or selling my children's school district a curriculum management system that at worst, at best, is flawed, at worst, is indoctrinating my kids. So I don't think you're bad, I think you're green. And so we have a lot of people in our education system who've been educated by those professors with all of these progressive teaching strategies, and they're the expert. But they're being used. And then you have the yellow people who, it's hard to know, but I think there's a lot of elected officials who've bought into the whole workforce innovation and opportunity program, and I think a lot of them are Republicans, and I think they're just fine with it. And I think they have business partners who are making a lot of money off of products or off of charter schools. The Bushes are making lots of money off of charter schools. So there's a lot of people that know a little bit more. And then you have the Linda Darling Hammonds, who happens to be very close friends with Bill Ayers. So you've got, and that's what, when we go out into our community and we understand the corruption within the public schools, the Ratliffs, the Mike Moses, you know, Thomas Ratliff's dad, Bill Ratliff, was instrumental when he was lieutenant governor and when he was a state senator in passing legislation that took power away from our local school boards and put it in the hands of the superintendents. It was through legislation they took that power away from our locally elected school boards. That was a political purpose. He also was a part of the Robin Hood, all kinds of bad legislation. His big buddy is Mike Moses, who ruined Dallas ISD. But they're very involved in TASA, and that's what, when I was asking who the superintendent was, now they have the consulting firms that they consult the school districts on the superintendents that they hire. And they're bringing in, it's interesting because if you go on TASA, you'll see this Texas Vision, the new Texas Vision. And they had a 23 school district consortium that was put together. It was passed, funding was passed, and these school districts are coming up and implementing these high priority standards. They're all the Common Core type standards. But it's all about workforce and innovation and opportunity. And so they're trying to move away from our Texas TEKS that are foundational, where one concept builds on the next, where we can test on those concepts, to where assessments are about attitudes, values, and beliefs. And in that ESEA reauthorization, if that passes, and we have the opportunity to stop it, but if it passes, there are mandates and reporting to the federal government on diagnostic interpretive assessments of our children. I said earlier I was going to close, but I have one more thing to tell you because this is important. In Texas, we had 3 major bills that fundamentally transformed our state, and it happened in the last session. The first one was Senate Bill 6. Texas used to have the stronghold on the textbooks because our permanent education fund purchased those textbooks. And we purchased so many that whatever Texas did, that's what the rest of the country did. Well, it's interesting because Thomas Ratliff, who's a paid lobbyist for Microsoft and a State Board of Education elected official, actually testified in favor of Senate Bill 6. Well, what did Senate Bill 6 do? It said that that permanent education fund no longer had to just be used for textbooks. It could be used for online curriculum. That's what opened the door to C-Scope. It could be used for professional development of teachers. So it went to the Education Service Center. And these instructional materials, which is what they renamed it instead of textbooks, instructional materials only had to cover 50% of the Texas TEKS, no longer the 100%. And publishers no longer had to go through the State Board of Education review process of our textbooks, where we could fight those battles with the liberals on what was going into those textbooks. Publishers could sell directly to the school district. That is what opened up Pandora's box for Common Core instructional materials to flood into Texas, and the publishers no longer listened to Texas. They listened to who was buying the Common Core. So that's Senate Bill 6, and it passed overwhelmingly by Republicans and Democrats alike. That was Senate Bill 6. Then you had HB 5, which I talked about before, which the pathways to graduation. The third one is the most scary in my opinion. We passed HB 2103 that set up 3 education research centers in the state of Texas that now have access to our children and their teachers' personal information without parental consent. And the reason why we know this is because in 2002, with No Child Left Behind reauthorization, or that act, then it came the mandates for all the assessments and the testing. And so the state had to have a longitudinal database system, or a database system to keep all that data on the assessments. So all 50 states set up these longitudinal database systems. Now it's interesting because you can't have a national database system on with individual children's information. So what do? They set up 50 database systems that are all exactly alike. So that was in 2002. In 2009, with the stimulus package, Texas, all 50 states took money out of the stimulus package. Texas took $18+ million to update our longitudinal database system that's housed with the TEA. And so that was in 2009. In 2010, they had to report to the federal government on their progress. In 2011, Obama changed, he didn't change the law, but he changed the regulation on the FERPA law, which is kind of like the HIPAA law or healthcare, but FERPA is our privacy protection on our children, their private data at school. He changed it to the regulation that in the name of education research, that information can be accessed without parental consent. So when you see legislation from a national level, and then you see the same legislation passing in all 50 states, it was interesting because at the time when HB 2103 was going through the process, I heard this lady from Oklahoma, Jenny White, talking about this P20, and I was going, oh, Texas, we're so good. We don't have Common Core. We said no to Common Core. Well, I just happened to put in P20, 83rd legislative session, and HB 2103 popped up. So we were passing that legislation. So you have to look at the strategies and tactics. You have to look at national legislation. You have to look at state legislation. So I know that there's all these people saying school choice, school choice, school choice. We've got to get rid of the status quo. I know there's corruption in the public schools. I know who the Ratliffs are. But I also know who's pushing legislation at a national level and a state level who are Republicans, who are trying to control it for corporate purposes. So I know that this is all bad news, But let me tell you something, there is some good news. There's another lady, Dr. Peg Luxick, who's incredible. She's a wonderful woman. She's been fighting outcome-based education from back in the 80s and 90s when she started figuring out what was going on. And someone asked her, why is it all these women who are out battling against education? What's going on in education? And she said, a man will die for his child. He will stand in the line of fire and die for his child. A mother will kill. And I'm one of those moms. And I know a lot of other moms. So it was kind of funny when Ratliff came after me, because I was like, bring it on, buddy. Because you just think it's me? No. And with Women on the Wall, our goal is to motivate and get to those moms. And dads too. There's other great dads out there fighting. But we want to get that instinct in those moms. So our call to action is to ask moms and dads and taxpayers and grandparents to go into the schools and ask 3 questions. Can I see what you're teaching my child or my grandchild? What you're teaching. Can I see how you're teaching? What's the professional development? What are what conferences are my tax dollars going for the teacher or the administrators to go to? Who are the people speaking at those conferences? Are they Linda Darling Hammond? Or are they people like John Saxon and Saxon Math? So how is my child being taught? And number 3, can I see who's financially benefiting from the curriculum products on which my child's teacher is being evaluated? There are a lot of wonderful veteran teachers who are being weeded out of the system. And we need to expose who's financially benefiting, and that these teachers they're green and they're like Dr. Stillman, their family's income. They can't rat out what's going in, because what's coming into the school, because they'll lose their job, and that's their family's income. So we're asking people to go in and see. And what we have found is when people will go in and start asking questions and they start getting pushback, it goes from, can I see, which is a really weak position as a parent. Can I see what you're teaching my child? It goes from, can I see, to I can see. I can see because this is my child. I can see what you're teaching my child. I can see how you're teaching my child, and I can see who's financially benefiting. And I'm not going to take it anymore. And, you know, once people start organizing, and we're in the process of writing this, it's almost like a study of the big picture of all this, of Common Core, but for community members to take this study. It's almost like I know y'all, most of y'all are men here, but you may have heard of Beth Moore, the Beth Moore Bible Studies, and I love Beth Moore, but where you go in and you agree to do a 4 or 6 week study on this of Common Core, of the workforce development plan. And so you have community members do a 4-week study. And after that 4 weeks, that group of people becomes what I call the connected authority in your local community. And I'm what's known as a connected authority. It's not because I've got some doctorate or something. It's just because I've done a lot of research and I put information out. When I go to school board meetings, they know me well. But I don't go in as attacking the school board. I go in saying, okay, I was just watching the hearings on the ESEA reauthorization, and this is what's coming in. How are you, as my local school board, going to fortify and protect our community? So I'm educating them, and I'm giving them information. I'm not their adversary. I'm working with them to fortify our school from the state and federal government. So if you can get people who are seen as that connected authority in your local community, and then you've got the Engaged minority, that's you guys. You're the ones that actually show up at meetings. So if you have the connected authority, you've got the engaged minority, and then you've got that passive majority that's still watching Dancing with the Stars and Clueless. But if you can increase your number of people who are the connected authority, and you can increase your number of engaged minority, and you do that by creating content, by being, having people that go to school board meetings and get up and speak, and you have someone film it, and then you put it up on YouTube by the next morning, and then even people that don't go to that school board meeting find out what was said at that school board meeting. We've got to use those kind of tactics. So if we can, and that's what we're doing with Women on the Wall, is going around the state and helping to build those communication teams of people, the connected authority. And we're willing to do it. If any of y'all have family members, have people that you know in this community who are not Tea Party people, not grassroots people, but are just moms and dads, I will be more than happy to come and meet with a group of moms in someone's home for coffee in the morning and get them kind of up to speed. That's how we're gonna fight this battle. And I'm seeing it happen. Just know it is happening. And they're not gonna care about the politicians or the stuff that we care about, because we're crazy like that. All they care about is that their fourth graders coming home every night crying and they can't do their math with them. Those are the people I need to see.